I hope you find today useful in just working out where we're at on Brexit at the moment and confirming the actions that you need to take off the back of that. One of the people in the session we ran a week or two ago sort of says in a slightly complaining tone, not much has changed since your last session, which I think hopefully is a good thing, and really one of the purposes of today, which is to kind of emphasise actually, I think the position for EU nationals and their family members who are already in the UK is pretty solid and known, irrespective of the outcome of Brexit, and hasn't actually changed significantly since we last got together. What are we going to do? Well, I thought we'd just touch on some recent developments in big picture terms on Brexit, but not spend long on that because, well, your guess is as good as mine, really, about where things could end up. And yeah, there's not much point in speculating. So we're going to spend most of the time looking at the EU settlement scheme, so how it works, the eligibility criteria, the rights that you have, family reunion rights, the application process, differences, deal and no deal scenarios. I'll touch on some other issues towards the end. I'll touch on some stuff around driving licences and healthcare and pensions, just in big picture terms, and then flag up some kind of key points on nationality issues. So if you're thinking about applying for British citizenship, what are some of the things that you might want to be thinking about on that? I think we're being filmed today, so I'll probably try and keep it a little bit more structured than I normally do. So we'll probably make sure we just stop for questions at certain points, so those can be edited out if they need to be, if that's okay. If you think, oh, I've gone over something and I haven't answered a question that you've got as I go through the material, you might find I do come back to it later. I tend to start big picture and then kind of go into the detail as we go. Okay, so where do we stand at the moment? Well, today all seems full of excitement, doesn't it, in terms of what's going on with the UK and the EU negotiations. But at the moment, we are still due to leave on the 31st of October 2019. Probably that can only happen if there is a no-deal scenario now. So even if something is agreed with the EU, it's just not possible because of the legal mechanics for the UK to leave on that day. There have to be a technical extension. So really, most things are up for grabs. We could be leaving on that date, we could be leaving on a slightly delayed date. It might all fall apart and the UK has to put in for an extension, which may or may not be granted, which could take us into 2020. We could have a deal Brexit or a no-deal Brexit. But I think the key point I want to get across today is that really, whatever the outcome, whatever happens, fundamentally, the status for EU nationals and family members who are in the UK by the 31st of October, so by the Brexit date, should essentially be the same, deal or no deal. That's because the government is going to run the EU settlement scheme that confers this status on EU nationals, deal or no deal. So some of the news stories that have been floating around in recent weeks around, we're going to end free movement and some quite tough government speak. Really, most of that stuff relates to people who will come into the UK to start residence after Brexit in a no-deal scenario. It doesn't relate to people who are already here, already resident and covered by the settlement scheme. Okay, so I'm going to run through the settlement scheme. I'll start fairly big picture and then drill down into detail. And for those of you that did attend some previous sessions, much of this is going to be familiar with a few new bits I've woven in. So as I say, this is the scheme that the government is running to, if you like, confer, give a status to EU nationals and family members who are in the UK by the 31st of October. And actually, if we have a deal scenario, it should be run for anybody who's entering all the way up until the end of December 2020, for a much bigger time window. And this essentially operates to preserve your status and right to stay in the UK, as we'll see. So the way it works is if you've got 5 years continuous residency, you've been living in the UK for 5 years in a row, then you can immediately get what's called settled status, which is an indefinite, essentially unrestricted right to stay in the UK. Less than 5 years, you can get what's called pre-settled status, which gives you a 5-year permission to remain in the UK. Carry on living, working, kind of business as usual, and then when you accrue, when you rack up 5 years. At some point in the future, within that 5-year period, you can then apply for settled status at that point in time. So basically, provided you're in by the 31st of October, you're in the group of people covered by this scheme, and one way or another, it's in your control to get to having settled status. That's the good news, I think. Also covers non-EU national family members of EU nationals, which is a bit of a mouthful, but you're probably aware that there are lots of people who are resident in the UK able to be here because of their relationship with an EU national. So there might be a French national who's married to an Australian national. The Australian national is here, able to be here because of the French national's right to be here. They get rights off the back of that. That Australian national spouse is covered by this scheme in the same way, needs to apply under this scheme in the same way as the French national. Children under 21 also need to apply, and potentially other family members are brought into it as well, and I'll come back to that a bit later. Remember, the whole family, effectively, each person would need to be applying. Yeah, so who needs to apply is a good question. I mean, I've still come across some people who say, oh, I've been here 30 years, clearly I don't need to apply. I've been paying taxes for 30 years, what's the problem? The basic way to think about it is, my advice is that all EU nationals, and indeed EEA nationals that are not EU nationals, so Norway, Liechtenstein, Iceland, and also Switzerland, should be applying under this scheme. There are some exceptions where people don't have to apply. So there is an exception for people who've got what's called indefinite leave to remain or enter under kind of older rules that would have been got in most cases years ago. You'd know about it with a stamp and a passport, perhaps a letter. You don't have to apply under the settlement scheme, but actually my advice is it's sensible to do so because the rights that you get under the scheme are slightly more favourable than the rights that you have with your current status. I'll come back to that a bit later. Irish nationals, again, don't have to apply, but they can apply if they want to. And I think my view is it's difficult to see any detriment from applying. It may be sensible to do so. I would be inclined to do so if I were Irish, would be my view. And certainly family members of Irish nationals who are not Irish do need to apply, like an American or Australian spouse, for example. If you apply for permanent residence documents, which did anyone apply for permanent residence? Yeah, there are some people, which is a sensible step to take whilst Brexit was unfolded, well it's still unfolding, but was even more uncertain. You still have to apply under this scheme, so you don't get an exemption because you've applied for permanent residence. You must still apply under this scheme. If you don't do so, in the end, your permanent residence documents, they won't provide any basis for you to stay lawfully in the UK. How many people have already applied under the scheme? Just give me a feel. So most people, okay. Great, so some of this is going to be a little bit basic, perhaps, but we'll cover it anyway for the purposes of the recording. Yeah, so the scheme's open, as you know. I mean, lots of you applied. You could have applied from in last year, actually, under the NHS pilot. That's now been out of date. About 1.75 million on the last stats I saw yesterday have now been processed, so heading up towards the 3 or 4 million that need to be processed, probably. What's the deadline for applications? So if there's a no-deal scenario, there is a hard deadline of applying of the end of December 2020. In a deal scenario, it should be 6 months later at the end of June 2021. So that's the deadline. So actually you've still got, even in a no-deal scenario, for those that haven't yet applied, you've got another year and a bit to do so. So the question is, well, is it sensible to apply before the Brexit date, before the end of October this year? And I think the answer to that is there's no need to do so because that's not a deadline. But many people will take the view that it might be sensible to do so because it means that you're in the system, it's job done, and if we end up in a no-deal scenario, there's much less question out there about whether you were a resident before Brexit or after Brexit, and those two categories would attract a different set of rights in a no-deal scenario. There would clearly be other ways to evidence you were a resident, like the fact that you're in employment, you'd have utility bills and so forth, but it's perhaps just a way of just putting all of that beyond doubt. There might be a timing point for some people, though. It might, for some people, make more sense to hang on a bit if they're going to get only pre-settled status and apply for pre-settled status at some point next year, so the 5-year period for that doesn't start to run until a later date. If they're going to have problems getting to settled status because of absences, let's say. So you've got to be a bit careful, think about it personally. But as a general rule of thumb, it's probably sensible to get on with it sooner rather than later. So people have questions about the rights that you have under the settlement scheme. And I think, really the headline I want to get across here is I don't think there is scope to have any real concerns about the rights that you have as somebody with settled status and the ability for you to then live in the UK and access all of the services that you need to be able to access. So this is a category that is what they call free of immigration control. So effectively what it means is that you've got an indefinite, unrestricted right to stay. You don't have to keep applying for visas. You don't have to meet any ongoing requirements to stay in the UK, like to be in work, or to be studying, or to be paying tax, or anything like that. It's a status where you can do what you like, you can spend your life, watching TV, holidaying, whatever it might be. That would be fine if you wanted to do so. And then with that, you essentially get full access to all the kind of benefits and social entitlements that you need. So things like access to the NHS, which, as you probably know anyway, is residence-based in reality rather than nationality-based. Benefits, like child benefit, pension, social security, putting children in state schools. All of those are on an equivalent basis to British nationals. So you're not going to have a problem living and working and staying in the UK long term with this status. The difference is that someone who has British citizenship has, over and above someone who is settled in the country, tend to be around things like civic rights, so the ability to vote in certain elections, national elections, stand for certain office, obviously get a British passport, which can be useful for travel, those kinds of things, but it doesn't tend to relate to the core stuff that you need to be able to live in the UK and function. So can you lose status under the settlement scheme? And I think this is an important area to think about, particularly for pre-settled status. So the way it works is if you've got settled status, if you've acquired it, you leave the UK, you don't come back within a 5-year period, so you're out for more than 5 years, you would then lose the status and be back to square one, and you then have to apply to come into the UK under whatever rules apply at that point in time. We don't yet know what those rules might be. Some of you might have had letters that have been sent to you confirming your settled status that says that you lose it if you're outside the UK for more than 2 years. Has some people had that? You might have seen that. That's due to a kind of technicality around legislation being implemented, such that that's still to go through to provide for the 5-year period rather than the 2-year period, which is the current position in law. But the government's been very clear that a 5-year absence will be allowed. That's what's been agreed with the EU in the draft withdrawal agreements. That's what they say they will do in a no-deal scenario, so it should be 5 years. And actually you can get around that fairly easily, so just by coming back into the UK for a really short period of time should reset the clock to 0, and then when you leave, start a new 5-year absence running. So if you did want to relocate abroad, live abroad long term, work abroad long term, you can still keep this status if you really want to, just by arranging a trip to the UK. Technically for a whole day would suffice to reset that clock to 0. Pre-settled status you would lose if you're outside the UK for more than 2 years. But actually the key thing with pre-settled status always is not to be thinking about I've got pre-settled status for 5 years, I can leave for 2, but think, how can I make sure I get in a position where I can apply for settled status at some point before the expiry date of that pre-settled status 5-year period. You can't extend pre-settled status, so potentially if you get to the end of that you're not able to apply for settled status, you may not be able to switch into other immigration categories, you could kind of hit the buffers and be stuffed. So the key thing is make sure you get 5 years continuity to stay. I'll come on to the absence requirements for settled status in a minute, but they're much lower than 2 years in a row. So if you left the UK for 18, 19, 20 months and came back, that would break the chain of continuity for settled status. It's fine for pre-settled status, you keep it, but from when you come back in, it will reset your clock to 0 for a new 5-year period, and you're not going to have 5 years to run before the 5-year period that you've got at the moment expires. I'll come back to absences, as I say, in a moment. Okay, the criteria. So apologies for those of you, well, many people have already applied, but I will run through these. I mean, hopefully, as you'll testify, it is, I think, a straightforward application. Do you agree? Straightforward? Generally, so I would see it more as a kind of registration process than a visa application, really. So it's kind of glorified registration process. You've just got 3 criteria, so it's an identity check, residence check, potentially relationship, if let's say a child is being applied for, and a criminality and security. I'll unpick each of those in a minute. But I mean, just note at the outset that there isn't any requirement for anything else in order to get status. So people say, oh, to get settled status, don't I have to have been in work, or been paying tax, or doing some other qualifying activity? To which the answer is no. It's just about residence. It's just about time spent in the UK. Simple as that. You don't have to provide a travel log that lists all of your absences from the UK. You don't have to take language tests. You don't have to pay an NHS surcharge. So lots of things that you might have heard about or have colleagues talk about that are requirements of other visa applications, they don't apply to this. This is very streamlined, very straightforward, just those three criteria. So I mean, in terms of how those work, so identity, that works for most people through using an app that's available on Android phones at the moment. Everyone use that? Everyone not use that was applying? Everyone did. Okay, that's good.
I've sent mine.
Yeah, sent it, okay. Yeah, so for most people the way it works is that you get an app on an Android phone, they're available in HR to use, where you open up the app and it operates to scan your passport face and take a selfie photograph, and that is all you have to do for the purposes of an identity check if you've got a biometric passport, so kind of one of the more modern ones with a chip in it. If you just can't do that, or you've got old documents that don't work for the app, or you just for some reason can't get hold of an Android phone, you can't borrow somebody else's because you can use somebody else's, then you can send off the documents by post, like you were saying. You should get them back within 2 to 3 weeks.
But they don't put anything in the pass. Do we need any document?
No, and you wouldn't get anything in the passport at all. There'd be no endorsement or stamp or anything like that. They're just using that as the identity check. So when you send them off in hard copy, that's to have them copied, scanned and returned to you. So that is very straightforward. I mean, the app used to be a bit fiddly. I think it has improved quite a lot in recent weeks and months. I think they might have improved some of the tech behind it. In my experience, it works better on some phones than others for no particular reason. Sometimes on different days it works better than others. So if you are having a problem, maybe find someone else's phone or try it on a different day. You might find magically it does suddenly work. But I think it has improved significantly. They keep saying it is going to be rolled out to Apple products by the end of the year. That's an Apple issue, not a government issue to do with Apple software. So hopefully it will be available at some point this year on Apple products. Can I take questions at the end? Is that all right? Just at the end of this section. In terms of residence, how does that work? So residence works by you enter your national insurance number on the form, and then what the system does is that it does some automated checks against HMRC records, and if there's evidence of tax and national insurance being paid for a 5-year period, then that will be the only evidence they require of proof of residence in order to confer settled status. So you don't have to provide any other documents. So if you've been working for 5 years in a row, that should come up as evidence of tax and NI being paid. That's the proof of residence that they take. You don't have to provide utility bills, bank statements, anything else. Not because you have to pay tax and national insurance to qualify, they just use that as the shortcut evidence. If you've got periods where you've not been paying tax and NI, you've been out of work, had a baby, you've been studying, that kind of thing, the time out will still count for residence purposes if it's in the UK. It's just that you may have to provide extra evidence to evidence that residence. A bank statements would do for that purpose, and you scan them and upload them with your phone. You don't have to send off hard copies. Proof of study, if you've been studying, would be another option. Utility bills, there's a big list of documents you can provide as that evidence if you need to do so. And then in criminality and security, it's done by way of a declaration, and they will also do a check, they say, against like a police computer database. But really, even people with a criminal record normally aren't going to have an issue in getting status under the scheme. If you have, it'd be worth drilling into the guidance in a little bit of detail, but for most people that is not going to be an issue. It's not about low-level parking tickets or speeding points or those kinds of things. So I suppose the only complicated one, or slightly fiddly one, is the one around residence, isn't it? I think you'd say. So how does the continuous residence requirement work? How much time do you need to have spent in the UK to get settled status? So the way it works is that you can't be outside the UK for more than 6 months in total in any one of the 5 years you need to rely upon to get 5 years in a row, 5 years continuity. So if you go over 6 months out in total in a year, then you would break the chain of continuity and the clock would be reset to 0 from when you come back in. That's not necessarily a calendar year, that can be a 5-year period that starts on any date. And the way it should work is that the system should pick up from HMRC checks, whether there's evidence of a 5-year period that can be relied upon. But sometimes they don't work. Sometimes there seems to be a glitch, it doesn't pick up the tax record. So it's always worth thinking, okay, what 5-year period have I got in the past? And if the system comes back and says, we think you've only got pre-settled status, or we think you can provide some more evidence, make sure you do provide evidence in support of a 5-year period of residence so that you get the right status, like bank statements or P60s, those kinds of documents. You can have a longer period of absence in certain circumstances, and I'll put them on the slide there. So a single period of absence not exceeding 12 months for one of those reasons, and overseas posting might be pertinent. So if you've been sent to work overseas on a secondment arrangement or collaboration or something like that, or project for 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 months, then I think that would count as an overseas posting and wouldn't break a chain of continuity. An interesting point with a 5-year period is that the way it should work is that if you've got any 5-year period of continuous residence in the past, you should be able to rely on that, provided you've not been out of the UK for more than 5 years since. It doesn't have to be the last 5 years that you're relying upon. So, to give you an example, there might be somebody who started work in the UK 10 years ago, worked here for 6 years, left for a couple of years, just come back. That person should be able to get settled status based on that earlier 5-year period, because they've not been out of the UK for more than 5 years since. And again, because these automated checks don't always work that well, it is always worth thinking through your history, your time, the period you can rely upon, and if the system doesn't come back and say we think you've got settled status, to provide that extra evidence saying, well no, I have, here it is. It will get looked at by a caseworker, and it should then confirm the settled status rather than pre-settled status. So I've talked about the points around the apps and the supplementary evidence. There isn't a fee anymore, so that's not a disincentive to apply. And then if you're successful, what you'll get is a letter that's emailed to you that confirms your status, gives you a little bit of information about it. But that is not actually going to be the formal evidence of your status or right to stay in the UK. So what the government is doing is it's creating this online, what they call digital status checker, where your details will be available via a PIN code to access, to then show to a prospective employer or a prospective landlord for rent purposes, to evidence your right to work in the UK, your right, to live and rent in the UK. So the formal evidence is not the letter. The formal evidence is going to be this online digital status checker. I'd very strongly recommend keep the letter, keep it safe, put it in a filing cabinet, just in case. But it is that checker that's going to be the system. How it will work when we're coming out of the UK, we're not fully clear yet. I mean, effectively the government has said, look, deal or no deal, we're not going to change the ability of EU nationals to continue to enter the UK until the end of December 2020. So until the end of next year, it's kind of business as usual. And it should only be from the beginning of January 2021 that effectively needing to show we assume a status under the scheme is necessary to re-enter the UK. The way it seems it will work is that the status is attached to your ID document, and then when you scan the ID document, the passport, let's say, when you come into Heathrow or going through an e-gate, it will do a kind of cross-check against the database and then let you in or not, as the case may be. So it's to kind of link to your document. But that's not that shouldn't fundamentally be a point of relevance, as you say, until 2021. At the moment, it is being attached to a specific document, so if you did update your passport, having done it on your old passport, having applied under the scheme under the old passport, you do have to apply online, or fill out an online couple of boxes and send off the new document, the new passport, so that the status is reassigned, if you like, to your new document. I suspect that will get streamlined in the months and years ahead. I doubt they will continue to require a hard copy to be sent in, but that's a bit of a watch this space. That's not a big issue, but it might be, if you think about timing of an application, you're thinking, well, my passport's about to expire, how should I do it? It might be sensible to get your new passport first, and then apply after, so you've got a longer period before you have to go through this process of getting it reassigned. I think the other thing to note is you can at the moment use national ID cards as a basis for identity for applying. Or at least I think you still can. You certainly could do it until very recently. They are going to be phasing out national ID cards as a document to be able to enter the UK on over the coming months. So if you've got a choice between shall I use a passport or shall I use an ID card when applying, I would definitely use a passport, because that will certainly be a document that will be good for entering the UK into the future. Just again to avoid having to get it transferred to a different document at some point in the future.